Welcome to the Autism Blueprint Podcast. I'm your host, Janeen Herskovitz, and it's my goal to help you create a more peaceful home while living with autistic and neurodivergent loved ones. Each episode, we focus on a different room in the house and help you create a peace plan for your home. So let's get started. Hey, friends. As a parent of a non-speaking child, my journey with my son Ben has been both challenging and enlightening. When we first started exploring typing as a means of communication, I was filled with hope and some trepidation. I remember the moment that Ben began to type his thoughts. It was as if a door had been opened to a world that I had longed to access. However, I quickly realized that the process was not as straightforward as I had hoped. In our early attempts, I found myself presuming what he knew or felt, which sometimes led to misunderstandings and frustration. One of the first things that he told us was his favorite animal was a lion, which surprised me because I had no idea about that. It was a learning curve for all of us, and I knew I needed some guidance to navigate this new territory. But as things go in our families, I had to leave typing behind for a while for Ben while we attended to a few other behavioral and medical needs that he was experiencing. So we kind of let it go. And then one day I was listening to my favorite podcast, which is Uniquely Human with Dr. Barry Prezant. And I highly recommend that, by the way, and I'll link to that in the show notes. He had a guest with a non-speaking autistic man who was using a letterboard to answer questions about his life experiences. And the person supporting him with this communication was Elizabeth Vosseller. And I am thrilled to have her as a guest on the podcast today. She has nearly 30 years of experience as a speech-language pathologist, and Elizabeth specializes in working with individuals who have complex communication needs. She's dedicated her career to uncovering the expressive potential of non-speakers. In this episode, In this episode, we'll deep dive into spelling to communicate, or S2C, which is a method of communication exploring the importance of motor planning in communication and the critical concept of presuming competence. Elizabeth shares her insights on how we can better support our children and challenge the narratives that limit their potential. So join us in the classroom today as we discuss the emotional landscape for both non-speakers and their families, and discover how we can empower our children to express themselves fully. So here's my conversation with Elizabeth. Well, Elizabeth Vosseller, thank you for being on the Autism Blueprint podcast today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thank you for having me here as a guest.
Yes, it's my pleasure to have you. I'm very excited. Can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with spelling to communicate?
Sure. Well, I am a speech language pathologist by trade and have been for nearly 30 years, if not exactly 30 years. It goes by so fast. And I didn't set out to specialize in autism or folks with complex communication. It just is what evolved for me. I started my career at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C. I live in Northern Virginia and am pretty much a Northern Virginia native. And I was sent, kids to assess and work with who were autistic, and people liked the work that I did. And so then that led to more and more referrals. And before you knew it, I was a specialist in this area. And then I went on to teach at George Washington University for 12 years, where I taught in speech and language to undergrad and master's students, and then also in the Graduate School of Education and Human Development. And then I moved into my own private practice. So over that time, I started specializing not only in autism, but in people with complex communication disabilities. And I always knew from early on that they were in there, right? And part of it is they outsmarted me too many times. Part of it was you'd see that light come on in their eyes, that they were understanding what you were talking about. Sometimes it was that I would say something subtly funny to the parent, or something maybe deeper or a touch sad, and they would respond with according emotion, right? And it
Mm.
wasn't just that something was uproariously funny, so you laugh because somebody else is laughing, or so sad that you see people crying and you cry. It was just that subtle thing. And so I always believed that they were understanding everything that was being said to them, around them. And and I worked very hard to make sure I was treating them accordingly, right? Talking to
Mhm.
them at age appropriate levels, not letting people say negative things in front of them. And so there was always this desire to get the expressive side out. And I
Yeah.
did every traditional thing. When new ideas would come out, I would do those. I stayed within the traditional model. And although I made progress with some of my clients, and I have many who I had been seeing for years and years and years, I tend to be a lifer, and develop very long-term relationships with my clients. I just wasn't getting that progress. We were making progress, but it was infinitesimal, right?
Yeah.
And so I turned to trying to teach the spelling. And at first I started with typing, right? A lot of my kids were taking typing in school, and but it would end up being this very scripted typing,
Mhm.
of I went to school today. I wore a green shirt. I ate grapes for lunch. I did yoga in PE. And the next day or the next week would be I wore a blue shirt. I had, chips for lunch. And it would just fit in this formula. And it wasn't really that expressive, robust kind of communication that you're looking for. And it wasn't until I started breaking down the motor steps to teach the motor. And that was the big shift, right? And and in that moment of realizing that this is about the motor, not about the cognitive, do you know the word, right? Not about the behavior, are you motivated to say this word, but in the motor. And it was a little bit like that. I wish I had a V8 moment. Remember those
Right.
commercials? Because I had even taught that when I taught at GW, right? I taught my
Mhm.
students that all communication is motor. I taught the anatomy and physiology of speech. And so, but it's just not the way we were looking at autistic folks or folks with complex communication disorders. Even though people have been looking at the motor in autism since the late 90s, starting with Anne Donnellan and Martha Leary and their really groundbreaking work. And it's taken until I would say about the last decade, and even more so the last 5 years, where we're seeing a real shift of researchers looking at the motor component in autism.
Yes.
And to
Thank goodness. Can you explain a little bit about what you mean by the motor? Because when I talk to parents about it, their first comment is, "Well, my child doesn't have trouble with motor skills. He
right.
actually has really great motor skills." And that was something that I thought.
Right. And there is that thought because they're moving around. Motor doesn't mean non ambulatory. But if you look at, I mean, the research will tell us that 2/3 of autistic people have apraxia, which is this breakdown in motor planning, right?
Mhm.
And so it is going from idea to plan to executing that plan to adapting if the plan goes wrong. So if I think to myself, I want to sip on my coffee, I know that the plan is reach out, my arm, grab my coffee cup, bring it back, and take a sip. So then I have to execute that plan. I have to actually do it. So the brain sends the message out to the motor neurons to fire in the body to do the command. So So that's the first place that our folks break down. Their idea is perfect, their plan is perfect, but there's a breakdown between planning and execution. So they have a hard time, getting the body to respond to the brain's message. And then because sensory is off in autistic people, right? It's either too much or too little at any given time or any given stimulus, that when I reach out, if I'm looking at you for my coffee cup, my hand hitting nothing tells me, oops, that's not it. So I can adjust one of two ways, both using my sensory. I can feel around until I feel my coffee cup and can touch it, or I can shift my gaze and look at the coffee cup, and then my hand will go right to it. So that's the second place where our community breaks down. But even if you look at our population of non-speakers who are successful in spelling, you can see those motor differences. They're still walking, they're still doing
Mhm.
things. But if you put anyone of a non-speaking person next to same aged peer, neurotypical, and walked him down the hallway, even the mailman can look and go, that guy moves a little bit differently, right? And is it a little shift in the body? Is it that they're leaning against the wall because they really want that thigmotaxis, right? That feeling
Right.
up against something. Are they walking with a uneven gait pattern or a rhythm that's just theirs, right? You can see that pattern, and that's really what Anne Donnellan and Martha Leary were talking about in the late 90s, and that we're just kind of catching up to now. And now there's more researchers from all different disciplines really looking at this. And what we see is that 2/3 of autistic people are apraxic. 1/3, the apraxia is significant enough that it affects speech. And that's why we have that continuum of people who say absolutely no words to some who are minimally speaking, who have a couple words to a couple hundred words or phrases, and usually they've been practiced over and over again, to those who are unreliably speaking, who talk all the time, but there are a lot of repetitive loops, phrases, questions asked over and over, despite the same answer over and over.
Yes. Yes.
That's that continuum. And I always stress that because some people will say, well, my kid does speak some, right? And so therefore this
Yes.
is not for them. And what non-speaking really means is you cannot use speech as a reliable and effective means of communication. So we do have that continuum. And I would say that 70% of our caseload worldwide is autistic.
Mhm.
30% have some other etiology, right? Some other diagnosis. And a lot of times those are kids who have syndromes or genetic conditions that have affected the motor sensory system. So it could be
Mhm.
Down syndrome, Phelan-McDermott, Angelman's, tubular sclerosis complex, Pitt-Hopkins. There's a number of genetic conditions that also present with apraxia and motor complications.
Right. Yeah, so I thank you for explaining that. So when people hear about spelling to communicate, they say usually to me, well, is this like RPM? Is this like facilitated communication? Like, how is this different from the other methodologies?
I have respect for all of the methodologies that, that teach spelling as a means of communication. And I really can only speak to S2C because, although I do know some about those methodologies, I'm not, currently and highly trained in it. I can tell you that for S2C, our emphasis is on motor. And from that, we've broken it down into a systematic process. We have standard accommodations, and then we have a process for when someone needs a one-off individual accommodation. And we're really governed by what I call the 4 R's, which is replicability, right? To make sure that if you start spelling with me or you start spelling with a practitioner in Florida or a practitioner in South Africa, that although we might have different personalities, the method is the same. And so it needs to be the same if you want to also be able to communicate with your child and for them to be able to communicate with various CRPs. So we really value that standardization and replicability. Um, Reliability is making sure that we're protecting the integrity of the non-speaker's communication, that
Mhm.
we're avoiding any type of influence, that it is their message coming across. And so that goes down to even how we ask a question without prejudice or bias. That we respect word boundaries, that we're very careful not to word predict or make any predictions, because someone
Mm.
might be spelling Beaut and you think it's beautiful, but it could be beauty, right? It
Mhm.
could
Right.
be butte, like crested butte, right? So we have to be very careful to respect the word boundaries. We have to be careful that we're holding the board steady, that there is no movement from the CRP. So we're careful about that for reliability. Responsibility is really sticking in our lane, and that once we have open communication does not mean that it's within our purview as S2C practitioners or even CRPs to just talk about anything, right? We're not counselors. We're not, religious leaders or whatever. That there are certain things like you wouldn't expect your neurotypical kid to go to school and have the teacher ask, "What are your thoughts on God? How's your
Right.
relationship with your family? What's your parents'
Right.
marriage like?" Right?
Right, and Elizabeth, honestly, I've been guilty of that when we first started typing with my son. I was like, "Oh my gosh, he's in there. What do you think about this? How do you feel about this?" And eventually we had 2 iPads go in the swimming pool because he was like, "No, I
Right,
don't want to
right.
and I had forgotten to tell him that you don't have to answer every question, right? And I think some of our kids are so, kind of it's ingrained in them that when an adult asks you a question, you answer it, and you're not allowed to say no, and you have to
That's
comply.
so important because
Yeah.
really kids in the special ed system survive the special ed system by pleasing what I call the adult unit, whether that's a parent or a teacher or a therapist or whoever. That's how you get the good stuff. That's how you get the rewards, the recess, the this, the that. And we have to be really careful of that. And just because you can communicate doesn't mean you want to tell me everything. And you and I just met. We don't have that relationship. Maybe years of friendship, there are certain things you might want to confide in me or things like that. But we really see this blurring of boundaries. And so we're very
Mm.
careful about responsibility and ethics and have a strong code of ethics and scope of practice, that we're not getting outside of our practice. And the fourth R is researchability. And this is really critical because in S2C, we really value the consistency of the practice, not only for the reasons I mentioned, but also so that we can collect data. And we are participating with researchers around the world. And as one of my colleagues, Liz Torres, says, the data needs to be consistent, or otherwise you're comparing apples and avocados, right? And so we need to know that if you are getting data from a student that I'm working with or one that someone in um, South Africa is working with, or New Zealand or Cleveland, that it's going to be consistent in the same data and the same procedures and the same rigor was used. And research is critically important, not only because we don't know much about non-speakers, because they're left out of most studies about autism and other communication studies, but also because if we ever want to have this accepted in public schools or be reimbursable by insurance, which then will make it truly accessible for everyone, then we need
Yes.
this research to be done. So that's how I can speak to what S2C does. And I think if people want comparisons, and then they should really go look at other methodologies, because I don't think that I'm well equipped to speak to those methodologies.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate you breaking that down. I think the research component is something that a lot of people don't understand, because when we say that certain, behavior modification methods are research based, they really lend themselves, some of them lend themselves really well to collecting data, right? Because they're data based, the way that they're set up. So I can see where this could really be a challenge, but you guys are doing this all over the world.
Right. And we actually have a lot of data because we keep a transcript on every single session. Right. So
Nice.
we don't record exact accuracy data, but you've got kind of a mental count in your head because that helps with the progression.
Mhm.
Again, along the lines of our folks, kind of growing up being pleasers, there's also very well aware of that data collection, which is highly anxious. So we keep a transcript of everything that they spell, of their responses. So you start to see how many questions can they answer in a session. You start to see that pick up as they do more in the same amount of time. What's the nature of the questions from closed-ended to more open? We have a rough data count in our head. So we are trying to collect that data. And then there's researchers who are looking at some really innovative ways of looking at movement, like using sensors that might even be just like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or heart rate monitors, and some really cool ways of capturing data. But one thing is, I talk to a lot of researchers, and we don't do the research ourselves on S2C because I don't want anybody to ever come back and say, well, we're just setting up a study to serve our purposes. But we do collaborate with a number of researchers around the world who are at level one autism research universities and doing very good science. And but we're there to talk about, is this appropriate for non-speakers? Is this doable? We have non-speakers who serve as advisors to researchers, to let them know, is this doable? Is this accessible? What can make this study more feasible? But many times I'll meet a researcher and they'll say, oh, yes, I study autism. And I say, great. How many non speaking subjects do you have? And they'll say, oh, well, none. It's really hard to get them in my lab. It's hard to get them to participate, and
Yeah.
which I would disagree with. I think you just have to have the right
Mhm.
supports. But if they're not in the studies, then that data does not reflect this population. It would be like a study of only male subjects and saying that the results also pertain to women, right? We know.
See, imagine that, Elizabeth. I don't know. Is
But
that happening?
imagine a scenario where that's possible.
I think every woman knows that that happens. Yes, yes, yes. We can't
Absolutely.
have that happen to our kids. We can't have that happen to
Right.
non-speakers.
Right. And we just need to understand what's going on with regulation, what's going on with motor, what
Yeah.
are their cognitive processes like. I see
Mm.
a lot of people, it's so common to sit there in a session and we use cognitive lessons because this gives us a shared experience, right?
Okay.
I don't know
So
what
like an academic, you by that you mean like an academic
could be
subject?
academic, it could be about current events, it could be, but there's something that's a structured lesson. It could be a lesson on song lyrics, but it's something that now we have a shared experience. And
Mhm.
so we're both sharing this information. One, it's feeding the brains. We want to engage the brain and the body. We want to be practicing around novel, new information so that it's not that rote information, right? That might come out as automatic and overlearned. I want something that's new. What's your ability to listen to new things, be able to respond to it, and sync that brain and body together, right? That's what we're really looking for, because right now there's a disconnect between brain and body. So we're
Mhm.
slowing everything down so we can get that synchrony, that connection between brain and body. And we do these lessons, we try to make them really engaging. So they're like the most interesting dinner party conversation, of like, oh, did you know this? And get into this information. But it gives a shared context so that I know what you know, right? There's a skill in language that we call presupposition, that I can't just say to you, Jimmy lives in Taiwan, without explaining to you first that I have a son named Jimmy who has been living in Asia for the past 8 years and is currently living in Taiwan. Once we've established that information, it's called presupposition, then I can now replace Jimmy with he, right? And it can say he is studying Mandarin, and we can go on from there. So a lesson lets us have this shared experience. So I know what you know in there. And in the beginning
Mm.
stages, I need to know what the target is because I'm coaching the motor to get to that target. And then we can, as the speller is more accurate, we can open up and say, um, if I'm doing a lesson on France, tell me another country in Europe. Maybe I didn't teach that part. Now I can get out of there. Or if they're really, really open, I can say, what would your dream vacation to France look like? Now it's
Mm.
very open ended, but we've established this shared context during the lesson.
I love that, because I'm just thinking about kind of some of the mistakes that I made with my own son when we first started typing, and he loves to learn,
Yes,
and I think that a lot of us assume that because our kids don't talk about certain things or script about certain things that they're not interested.
right.
But, as soon as we started typing, I learned that my son had a favorite animal, and it was a lion, and I learned he had a favorite planet, and it was just fascinating. But I kind of got stuck in kind of what you're talking about. I was presuming his competence, which I would like you to talk a little bit about, but I think I was also presuming some knowledge too.
Right.
Can you speak to, I talk about presumption of competence a lot. And so the people that listen to the pod know that that's my soapbox moment, right? We have to err on the side of the kids are in there. So
Right.
speak a little bit about that.
Sure. So presuming competence really boils down to the belief that individuals can and want to learn. And it's our job to teach them. It's sort of like how I started, right? When I said I just knew they were in there and I was doing everything I had ever been taught to do. When there was a new training in something else, I'd look for that and I tried that thing and it still wasn't getting it. So I had to keep going and going and going until I found a way so that they can learn, right? And that was
Mhm.
what evolved into spelling to communicate. So it's the presumption that someone can and wants to learn, and it's our job to teach them. So knowledge is teaching. And there's a reason why kids will loop on the same things is because once you found one thing your kid liked, right? Whether it was a TV show, a song, a book, uh, uh, they failed to reject snakes, so everybody started buying them snaky stuff, right? Snake books, snake things, snake toys. And then the parent will say, hey, can you do a lesson on snakes? My kid likes snakes. And I'm like, well, he doesn't talk. How do you know he likes snakes? Well, he has all this snake stuff. And I'm like, does he have a job and money and he went to the snake store and bought this snake stuff? And they'll say, no, we bought the snake stuff. I'm like, oh, turns out you like snake stuff. So, I mean, it's a little bit silly, but we don't know what they like until they can communicate. And so we tend to inundate them with the same thing because they failed
Mhm.
to reject it, maybe. And even if they do like snake stuff, by the way, I'm not going to do a lesson on it because they may like a certain type of snake and maybe only, pythons. And I did one on garter snakes. And let me tell you, how do I know this? From experience, that it can go deeply sideways, right? If you're messing with someone's special interest, and you
Yeah.
don't hit that special interest just right. So, so we want to expose them to other things and give them that ability to talk about it. I
Mm.
don't know much about cars and engines. I drive one, but I don't really know how it works other than the basics. So if something's going wrong with my car, I'm not a good reporter to the mechanic because I can't say, oh, it's the blah, 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 because I don't have that vocabulary. I don't have the knowledge of what's going on. If I understood everything about a car, I could say it's the carburetor, which, by the way, I used this example, and a dad told me one time, he's like, Elizabeth, cars haven't had carburetors in a long time. And I'm like, ah, there goes my little bit of car knowledge, But I can't just go in. I can say, it kind of sounds like this, it's doing this. But to talk about something, you need to know about it, right? And so, because comprehension precedes expression. So, in teaching knowledge and exposing to it, it gives you the language to talk about it, and it's feeding the brain. So, that is teaching knowledge, right? And we don't just walk in and say, hey, here's a quiz, name all the countries in Europe. We can do a soft feel in what we call a prior knowledge question, which means, let's say we're going back to that example, I'm talking about France, and I have a lesson that France is a country in Europe, Paris is its capital, blah, blah, blah. And then I can throw out a prior knowledge question to see, do you know more about this, right? And I might say, name another city in France, name another country in Europe. And I do that based on what I can expect from the speller's age and life experience, right? I probably would ask that question to a 6-year-old, but I would absolutely ask that question to a 20-year-old. And
Yeah.
we color code our questions. One, it's useful for coaching. Two, it's useful just even as a practitioner to look down the list of questions and know where my speller is and hone in on those questions really fast. But the prior knowledge question sets us up with they may not know.
Mm,
Versus if I ask a known question, something that's directly from the lesson, and there's only one possible answer, like, what country are we talking about today? The only possible answer is France, right?
right.
And so I'm not really worried about anything I directly teach in the lesson, but I can feel around for where are your knowledge gaps and what do you actually know? Because information is everywhere, right?
Yeah, I'm dying to ask you tell me about a time when you were really surprised or a parent was like really surprised at something their children knew.
I am constantly surprised. And that's
Yeah.
where, by the way, presuming competence is it's a lifelong thing. It is leveling up all the time, right? And just to jump to that for a minute, I mean, so it was fairly easy for me to presume competence in the brain because I just firmly believed my kids were smart. Although I will tell you, early lessons I wrote, I would never use now because I thought
Right.
they were pretty good at the time and pushed that envelope. And now I find it really wasn't even close. Um, but I wasn't presuming competence in the body. And I had trained an OT to be an S2C practitioner. And we were doing a group, and here I was like opening up someone's Ziploc bag of snacks and unzipping their coat. And she looked at me and said, Evie, what are you doing? They can do that. It's like, oh, I wasn't presuming competence in the body. Or, you know, even at our annual conference last year, Metamorphosis, we have it every July in Northern Virginia. We did what we called Fast Friends. And it's sort of like speed dating, but for friends, where we set it up where every 20 minutes you could rotate and communicate with a new friend and exchange some information. And I thought, well, this is either going to go really well or it's going to be a hot mess because you've got about 90 non-speakers in the room with their
Oh my gosh.
communication partner, and the room went silent, as the communication started back and forth. And it was really amazing. But even then, that's a presumption of competence. Can 90 different people do this and transition and go through this? Um, but I'm constantly surprised by answers. Which has taught me not to predict, right? A word that I
Mm,
thought. Even early on, I asked a prior knowledge question. I did a lesson on baseball, which again is probably one that's pretty weak and I would not use again now. But I said, tell me another sport you play with a ball. Now, I'm not the sportiest gal in the world, but the kid hit P. And I was like, that seems strange. Let's try again. And I reset the boards and he hit P again. I'm like, we might be stuck in a loop. Drop the boards again. He hit P with emphasis. I'm like, okay, P it is. And then he proceeds to spell out polo. If you locked me in a room and said, write down ball sports, never in my life would I come up with polo, ever,
Right.
you know? And I mean, that was one of the first surprises. But I'm
Mm.
constantly surprised at what non-speakers spell. And I love the ones that reveal their personality, right? I've got one guy, he's now in his 30s, but you know, his dream girl is a beautiful blonde. And he worked beautiful blonde into conversations. And now I know because there's a little smirk that comes first, but it could be a lesson on Mars. You know, I mean, he works in you. And maybe there will be a beautiful blonde astronaut or, you know, whatever.
Oh.
But you can sometimes see the cheeky smile, and I'm like, oh, something's coming, you know. But I'm constantly surprised by the answers, or I'm
Mm.
surprised that halfway through a sentence, it just flips around and says something completely unexpected.
Mm.
That's the beauty and the fun.
That's really, really amazing. What a cool job you have.
It is a wonderful job. And I don't do as much clinical work as I used to because I do have a clinic, Growing Kids Therapy Center in Northern Virginia. But I have the best practitioners here who are amazing. And then I spend 96% of my time when in the nonprofit organization I ask that I set up. And that's i-asc.org. And I really encourage your listeners. We have so many resources on our website. It's a massive website. We've got
It is. It's
free
amazing.
lessons that we post. We have motor hacks, which teach you how to teach some motor skills. We've got a list of blogs written by non-speakers. We've got tons of blogs that are written by practitioners, by non-speakers. It's all searchable by topic. We do events. Every month we have a free webinar. Then we train S2C practitioners. So I get my clinical in with the training, and I sometimes go and do internships in a place where we don't. Like I'll be going to Ireland in late April, early May, and doing some community building out that way, but also doing our international cohorts training with one of our practitioners out there because we now have S2C practitioners in 43 of the 50 states. I'm still trying to get those other 7 in there,
Wow.
and in 25 countries around the world.
Wow. That is amazing.
It's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. And that's
Wow. So
where,
this is a whole other field that, people can go into,
yeah,
just as far as different therapies for autism.
yes. And we're always, you know, seeking people to train.
Mhm.
We really, you know, we're looking for people who particularly have backgrounds in education, whether that's regular general education or special education, any of the therapies, SLP, OT, PT, music therapy, nursing, clinical backgrounds. Um, you know, for some who have not seen it in practice and don't really know the non-speaking community well, we may have them do some prerequisite work. We do have career changers that we've got, you know, some more prerequisite work for, because really practitioners become the multipliers for non-speakers, right? For families to be able to have someone they can go to teach their kids and to teach them. And I would say that's one of the big other things about S2C is we strongly believe that you need a team of communication regulation partners that we call CRPs to
Mhm.
be able to support your kid, right? I don't live in your house. So
Mhm.
your kid needs access to communication 24/7. So I want parents on, grandparents, sibs, support workers, other people who can be there in that non-speaker's life to support their access to communication. So that's a huge emphasis on S2C is CRP training.
Mhm.
But practitioners are really the multipliers. So when we get someone in a community, it really helps increase the population of non-speakers there because there's someone that they can go to for support. But our job is always to make ourselves replaceable.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's really cool. I want to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk for a minute about, because I am a mental health counselor, my practice focuses mostly on these families.
Yeah.
Um, I'm wondering emotionally, just from an emotional standpoint, both for the speller. Do you call them spellers or typers?
I generally would call them spellers or non-speakers. Yeah.
Okay. So not only for the speller, but I'm thinking for the parents,
Yeah.
right? Who have gone a really long time, maybe not even knowing that they should have presumed competence. Like, what do you see happening emotionally in your clients?
So everything that I've said to you so far is based on fact, right? And we can point to it in the existing science. And there are two really good studies that really support the communication of non-speakers. There is a research page on our website you can go look at. I will tell you when I deviate from a known fact, and this is one of those points. But it is my contention, and I don't have proof for this, except I do have many clinical colleagues who agree that 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 all non-speakers have experienced trauma in their life just by virtue of being non-speaking. And I think if
Yes.
you're the parent of a non-speaker, you have experienced trauma in your life. So right
Yes.
there
Yes.
is a huge need, right? From people who said ugly things in front of your kid to you about your kid, the looks in the grocery store, the everything. And it's also my contention that kids, and I mean that broadly, kids to adults who are injurious to themselves or others, who tend to be physical, have high anxiety. And it is the anxiety that triggers that reflexive or impulsive hit, pinch, grab, etc.
Yes.
That it is not intentional, that it's not a behavior because it's
Yes.
triggered at a level where there are no thinking neurons. So therefore, it can't be a behavior. Behaviors are purposeful, right?
Yes.
I know very well how to annoy someone. I do it to my spouse. I do it to my brothers, even though we're adults. That's got intention behind it.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
being physical is triggered at a level of a brain. I mean, the brain for our non-speakers, it is usually impulsive. So it's the amygdala and the limbic brain, or it's reflexive and it's the brainstem and the spinal cord. I'm not saying that they're perfect angels. Every once in a while, I've seen someone execute a perfect plan where they walk across the room, pick up a book from the bookshelf, come over, and bonk you in the head with it.
Right.
That was intentional.
Yes.
I'll give you points for that one being intentional. But because of this, I think there is deep trauma. There is so much anxiety for both the spellers and their families.
Mm.
There's been a lack of acceptance. There's been a marginalization, a discrimination. So, absolutely, I think there are mental health issues. And
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
do have a couple of practitioners who are also counselors. We have a pretty hard rule in S2C that you can't do both at the same time. You can be an
Yes.
S2C practitioner and then you're practicing as S2C, and then you can be a counselor and you're practicing counseling, but you can't do both with the same client. So
That
there
makes
are
sense.
some of our folks who are counselors who see spellers as counselors, but they are not acting as the communication partner or doing any S2C. They're strictly doing counseling.
Oh, I would love to maybe talk to you after after we're done to connect me with some of those people, because that's something I would love to bring to our area.
Yeah.
Is, and I've always kind of seen it as that tell me again what the typing partner is called.
CRP, communication
CRP.
relationship partner.
Yeah, I've kind of seen them as I would an interpreter if
Yes.
I had
Now, a
someone speaking another language.
CRP, and preferably the CRP, is not a parent, right?
Correct.
Who I, in theory, could be a CRP in a counseling session with one of my spellers, with you as a counselor, right? If
Gotcha.
I
Yep.
were a counselor, I would not fulfill both roles because there's just too
Yes.
much. And
That makes sense.
and there are times that when there is no one else available, a parent has been a CRP, but that's tricky.
Mhm.
What if you want
Yes.
to say, my mom babies me? What if you want to say, I want to move out? Those can be tricky conversations to have if your parent is a CRP. Now, CRPs, we hope, are being objective and they're wearing, their hat and not influencing anything. They're strictly the interpreter.
Yeah.
But in the ideal situation, which is not always the reality situation, I get that. It would be somebody different, but it's so important. And one thing I would love to do as an organization is to educate more counselors about what do you need to know about non-speakers? What do you need to
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
about if you have them as clients? How to ask non-influencing questions? What's the
Mm.
appropriate boundaries with CRPs? That's something I would love to work on. So keep me in mind if you're interested.
Oh, yes. Oh, 100%. My wheels are turning, Elizabeth. I'm very excited about this. Yeah, and I agree with you 100% about the trauma. And I do think that in trauma research, there is some research that bears that out. That parents, I know there was a study done several years ago, maybe even a decade ago now, that parents receiving the diagnosis of autism affects parents with
Right,
PTSD, similar to
right,
combat soldiers. And I can tell you that that is absolutely true.
right.
Part of the reason I became a trauma therapist was because I had these parents coming into my office, and all of them were traumatized.
Yeah. And I
So
think that, for many parents, it's not a PTSD, it's a ongoing traumatic
yeah, acute
story,
stress, which I
right?
would say, yeah,
It's
it's
just,
constant.
yeah. And there's so much, and I think it's cumulative, and it's just not an area where we're providing enough support. There's an absolute need, and there's a need for an understanding so that we don't continue to contribute to that trauma too.
Oh, yes. 100%. I can't tell you how many, and again, right now I'm only working with speaking clients, and how many of them come in and we are processing things that happened to them in school, times that they were misunderstood by teachers, times that they were bullied on the playground and couldn't
Oh,
do anything about it, couldn't tell anybody.
right,
Right? I mean, I just can't even imagine. No wonder our kids are freaking out
right,
sometimes, you know?
right.
It's really difficult. So I'm so glad to have met you, Elizabeth, and to talk about these things. I want to be respectful of your time, but something that I ask everybody at the end of an interview with me is if every let me make it more streamlined. If every parent of a non-speaker were listening, what would you want them to know?
I would want them to rethink and challenge everything they've been told about their kid. I I get it. And there's so many times, that I have some parents who come in who have been pushed by a friend, who just won't stop bugging them.
Mm,
And that they have been told by so many people, your child's intellectual ability is that of a 2-year old, and they're not capable, and they don't understand you. I had one dad who said he was told by a neurologist, your kid doesn't know the difference between you and a chair. And it just
oh,
broke my heart to hear that. And so many people come in and I say, I understand, but I want you to know I'm going to talk to your kid at whatever age they are. So if they're 16, I'm going to talk to them like a 16-year-old, 20-year-old, whatever.
mm,
And that I believe they're in there, and I'm going to continue to believe that until I have absolute proof that they're not capable of learning. And I know that there's times that they look at me and they're like, you're just one crazy lady out of the hundreds of professionals we've seen, and you're telling us something so different. But I would say
mm.
challenge those things that you've been told. because the proof is generally testing. But every test of academics, of cognition, of education, of language requires a motor response, right? Touch
Yes.
it, put this in this, do this thing, right? Tell me this thing, circle this thing. And for our folks where their primary disability, and I don't care what their diagnosis is, but non-speakers, their primary disability is motor planning and execution, it is like giving a blind man a visual IQ test. So I would just
Yes.
say rethink what you've been told and challenge.
Mm,
And then
I
the other
love
thing
that.
people can start doing tomorrow is feed the brain, right? Listen to
Mm,
podcasts. If you don't know what podcasts an 8-year-old should listen to, Google it. Books,
mhm.
read to them, read out loud, play Audible books, play podcasts in the car, talk to them about what you're doing, just constantly feeding the brain, right? You and I learn all the time on our own, reading a book, watching a documentary.
Mhm.
Don't get quizzed at the end of it. Did we understand it? But humans are constantly seeking out new stimulus and new information and feeding the brain. Feed your kid's brain.
Love it. Elizabeth, thank you so much for coming on today and for giving us your
Pleasure.
time. It was such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And please feel free to reach out anytime. If parents want the resources, look at
Mhm.
i-asc.org. Don't forget the dash or you end up with avocado growers and you'll learn to make guac, but you won't learn how to spell.
Wonderful. And we'll link to all those things. They'll be in the show notes. So thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. Take care.
Bye-bye.
The information in this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional.